With oil prices around $30 a barrel, what's the impact on major oil producers and consumers? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Just 2 years ago, oil was selling for more than $115 a barrel. It recently dropped to just under $30, a 12-year low. And there's no consensus on what will happen next. Could this downward trend continue, or will prices steadily increase in the months ahead? In the meantime, the impact is being felt across the globe, from Saudi Arabia to Russia, China, India, Venezuela, and the United States. We begin with CCTV correspondent Yasser Hakim for an update on what's happening in the oil-rich Gulf states. He joins us from Cairo. And Yasser, what is the impact so far on falling oil prices in the major oil-producing Gulf states, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait?
Yes, these countries, Anand, depend heavily in their income on oil production and oil sales. They've been hit by $360 billion loss of revenues in 2015. Budget deficit has now reached 21.6%. 2016 is forecast to be around 19.1%. They know that although this low has happened before, the low prices before a decade or more, but this time could be different. This time it could stay for a while, and that's why they've taken measures. For the first time, you would see that they have reduced subsidies on energy. They have raised fuel prices and electricity prices in these countries. They have issued and established new taxes for the first time. Taxes on land, taxes on income in the Gulf states, things that have never been heard of in these states before. And also, they have devalued their currency by 2 to 3% against the dollar. So they're bracing for maybe some kind of a long-term vision, trying to decrease expenditure to manage to go through these storms of low oil prices. Anand.
Now, what about efforts to perhaps get the price going in the other direction, going up? I mean, there's a big oil cartel, OPEC. Most of these countries belong to OPEC. What do the member states want?
There's a lot of divisions concerning this issue. The Gulf states, the major contributors of OPEC, they want to keep the production as it is. They don't want to reduce production so that price goes up. They want to keep the levels as they are so that they can maintain some kind of income and revenue. Other countries, you've got the Latin American countries, Nigeria, they want to go to reduce, but they are suffering more than the Gulf Arab states. The Gulf states have considerable savings that can help them maintain this kind of level of production without needing to reduce production and increase prices at this point. And they feel that maybe there might be a slight change or adjustment of prices by the end of the year. That's what we know from OPEC ministers in the last couple of days, saying they might adjust the prices, increase the production by the end of the year. But right now, they're keeping it as it is, hoping that this will kick out, if you might say, from the market countries that are non-OPEC prices or high-cost producers, and to keep the market only for the OPEC producers to control the prices and the production later on. And you have to remember that Iran will be into the market very soon now that the international embargo is being lifted. So that's another producer and more supply in the market.
Thanks, Yasser. That's CCTV's Yasser Hakim reporting from Cairo. And for more now, joining me here in the studio is Abdul Latif Al-Mulhim. He is a columnist for the Saudi newspaper Al-Yawm. Also joining us from London is Keyu Jin. She is a professor at the London School of Economics. She specializes in international economics and the Chinese economy. And from Houston, we're joined by Carl Larry. He is an expert on the oil industry and is a director for Frost & Sullivan, an oil and gas consulting company. Welcome to all of you to the show. Abdul Latif, let me start with you. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. Oil accounts for something like 80% of the country's budget revenues. So how is the falling oil price going to affect the country?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. For the time being, the fall of the oil prices are not having a very severe impact on Saudi Arabia. If it continues at this price, $25 a barrel, it will take about 2 years before we would feel the difficulty of the low prices. At this time, no, maybe there are some projects being delayed or being held, which are not time necessary for the country. So right now everything so far so good.
So Saudi Arabia can sustain this kind of price for another 2 years, you say?
Yes. This is my presumption.
All right, let's look at the other side of the equation. China is the world's second largest oil consumer. Ko Yu-jin, what do these falling prices mean for China?
Well, actually, not a whole lot is the answer. Part of it because actually countries like China and India, what happens is that there are a lot of government-financed subsidies to oil prices to keep them down for consumers. So when oil prices peaked, there were a lot of costs for subsidies, and these governments have been trying to cut them down somehow. So right now, what is happening is simply that the subsidies are going down, but consumer prices are not changing so much. And also, secondly, part of the fall in oil prices has a lot to do with demand. So the fact that China's demand for oil might be, in a grand scale, falling back a little bit because they're shifting away from industrial production more to consumption also has something to do with it. So I have my doubts as to how much that would actually benefit China.
But China's oil demands this year will increase, wouldn't it? According to the China National Petroleum Corporation, it will go up by something like, what, 4.5%, 4.8%?
Right. I mean, I think that we still have to distinguish between, a lot of the production structure that is shifting away and the fact that you have more consumption and, embedded in consumption goods are still, oil prices are still an intermediate good. So that's possible. But still, it's not going to affect the final consumer prices by much, precisely because there were a lot of subsidies in the first place. And these subsidies are simply going to be cut back. But oil prices related products won't change by much in terms of prices for Chinese consumers.
Carl, let's look at the situation in the United States. Well, of course, motorists are very happy, cheap gas at the pumps, but the United States is also a producer of oil, and it's now producing at its highest level in something like 30 years. At the same time, of course, the price per barrel, as we know, is going down. So how does this affect U.S. oil producers?
Well, I think it's going to be a struggle at the start of the year, but at some point we're really going to have a whole different revolution of industrial production here. The last 2 years we set a demand record for refineries for crude, just over 16 million barrels a day. So that production is getting used, but now the game changer is that we're allowed to export it. So it could become something where we're the largest producer, the largest consumer, and possibly a chance to become one of the largest exporters.
But what about the cost of producing each barrel of oil? Is it more expensive than the cost to sell it right now?
Well, the cost changes. It depends a lot on location, but what's really changing is a lot of technology. We've seen a lot really happen in the past year that's almost cut a lot of the margins in half, or production margins in half, and been able to keep some of the producers, especially in the Gulf Coast area, viable. So there might be a lot of activity in the M&A space this coming year, but we're going to see production remain around 9 million barrels a day, maybe even grow if we can start exporting.
Abdul Latif, I was looking at some figures here on just to indicate how reliant Saudi Arabia is on oil. Oil makes up 45% of the country's GDP, 90% of its export earnings. Has Saudi Arabia been over-reliant on oil?
To be frank, yes, we are over-reliant on oil production. But before I go on, I would like to make comments on what the other guests have done. First of all, you have to look at oil like a swimming pool. Either you produce it in the United States or in Saudi Arabia or Russia or anywhere else. Swimming pool is like if you take from the diving board area or the ladder area, it's the same. So whatever is being produced in the United States is going to have the same effect being produced in Saudi Arabia. Also, the United States are still producing at such a low price because at many times the American economy is giving a lot of interest money for oil producing companies in the United States, and they are technically using what they have right now. But what really surprises us in Saudi Arabia is that the fall of the oil prices is going against many odds, like questions being asked. Why the United States is exporting oil when it's the prices of oil barrel is very low, at a time when they didn't allow it till like, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when the price of oil was 140 barrels a day. So everything right now in the oil market is simply going against every single economic analyst. So right now, many people are asking questions like, why the economic or the world is not taking advantage of this era when low oil price is being technically all over the world, like airlines, stuff like that. It's very confusing. But the questions we always ask: why is it Saudi Arabia? We read in one page in the Western press that Saudi Arabia is actually bringing the price of oil at very low point. At the same time, next day you would see papers in the same Western press saying that Saudi Arabia is not having the same influence they had in the oil market, and they are not the main swing producer right now.
But the cost of producing oil is not the same, is it? Saudi Arabia, it costs Saudi Arabia something like $10 to produce a barrel of oil.
Sometimes it costs less. This is what
right, and it costs a country like the United Kingdom. Yeah. In excess of $40.
Exactly. This is why we are surprised that the price of oil is going down at a time when there is like total economic unrest and total instability in many of the producing countries like Libya, Iraq, and Nigeria. Right now, the price of oil is going against all odds of any economic analyst. But this is why you have to look at the oil production, no matter what, as like a swimming pool. And right now, by the way, Saudi Arabia is doing a policy that is for the interest of the Saudis and Saudi Arabia. And we are not against shale oil. We are not against any country that produces oil. But there is a great oil production from non-OPEC members, but everybody is looking at the OPEC members and mainly Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Kuyu, one of the biggest bills that emerging countries have to pay is, of course, their energy bill, paying for oil. Now that the price is going down, are we going to see growth in these countries?
Well, we haven't seen anything like growth yet. And we also have to distinguish among emerging markets, because there are oil exporters and there are also oil importers. So for oil exporters, that's a pretty difficult time to come. But some countries are able to adjust better because they have financial and oil reserves, and some are able to adjust better because they have a floating exchange rate. And here Saudi Arabia, has a peg to the dollar, so it's a little bit more rigid. So those that have flexible exchange rates have been faring better. As for the oil importers, I think that one of the things that we have to realize is that the global paradigm has shifted from the past, which is that oil prices are no longer major drivers of global business cycles anymore. And we have to reconcile with the fact that because of shale technology and other new sources of energy, that this kind of global arrangement is changing. So also, thirdly, a lot of the effect is also coming from a global collapse in demand. So there are demand and supplies effect to the declining oil prices that we are observing.
And Carl, what are the other factors that have caused oil prices to drop?
Well, I think when you talk about the economies of the world, this is something that's a very big deal right now. The U.S., obviously, we still import about 7 million barrels a day of crude, so there is some of that, but most of it we're starting to import, we're seeing from Canada. We've increased our imports from Canada and their crude by nearly triple over the past 6 years. So, when you look at what's going on in North America, Canada, United States, and Mexico, and even down to Latin America, you're seeing some economies that are being buoyed by these lower oil prices. But around the rest of the world, they are feeling that shock of not making money on the exports and still having problems trying to operate on the low cost of oil. But, it's a global contagion right now that we're seeing across the world's economies, and the U.S. is growing, but just not fast enough to keep everybody up.
Right, Abdul Latif, you mentioned OPEC just a moment ago. We have oil-producing countries like Venezuela, Nigeria, calling for OPEC to get its act together, cut production, push prices up.
Well, as I said, the influence of OPEC is not having the same impact they used to years ago.
Why not? Is there a lack of unity?
No, not lack of unity, but there are other places in the whole world that are producing oil. Also, the technology of finding oil is very, very, very advanced. In the past, you would do hit and run, and you are losing money in just finding the oil. But right now, the technology is so advanced that there are many places are looking for oil that they are actually matching OPEC. Venezuela economy is different from Saudi Arabia because of the oil production ratio from producing the oil and to exporting it. So it's very difficult to compare Saudi Arabia and Venezuela.
Is there a fear on the part of some OPEC countries that if they cut production, they will lose their customers?
It's very, very hard to tell. For example, we have seen a very political activities in the Middle East. We have seen the Chinese presidents, many other world leaders coming to Saudi Arabia. This could be part of it, because of the oil. What really surprises me is that China is not taking advantage or more advantage of the oil prices, that they could boom their economy. And when the Chinese economy, with this massive size, like China and India, they are not moving things as fast as we expected. So talking about OPEC right now, it's very, very difficult. Much more difficult than in the past. If OPEC members do reduce the amount of oil, as I said, it's a swimming pool.
Right. Keyur, is that the case? Countries like China and India not taking advantage of this low oil price to grow their economies?
Well, to be frank, China's economy is not growing not because of oil, but because of other kind of major distortions in the economy and in a transition phase. But as I was saying, the oil price trickling down really actually onto consumer prices is going to be very limited, precisely because government is simply cutting back the subsidies.
What about those countries where, as I mentioned, it's producing a barrel of oil is very high? Canada, the United Kingdom. How long will they be able to sustain these losses? Because if they're producing at above, $27 a barrel, they're losing all the time, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think that this is going to persist for a while, because let's note that the global investment in oil has been cutting back, and this year, 2015, has fallen by $150 billion. So for the time for this to trickle into prices, to increasing prices, really takes time. So it will be some time before oil prices start to climb up, in my view. So potentially for these countries, it's a matter of at least maintaining a certain market share. So they're going to have to, make some losses for some time to come.
And Carl, what kind of effect does the oil price have on investment plans by energy producers in the United States? Will they cut back? Are we going to see workers being laid off?
I think there's a shift of workers here in the oil industry. We've seen a lot of producers who employed a lot of labor, shifting a lot of that labor to the downstream side, where you see refinery production really at its highs and actually expansion going on right now. So the labor force has been mitigated a little bit from the oil shock. But I do think that there's room for growth here. I think that investment's starting to look at this and saying this $25, $30 barrel of oil is about the bottom of what we're going to see as it goes up here, albeit slowly. I think that there's going to be room for investment, and we're going to see a lot of activity this coming year.
And are we going to see more growth in that sector where people are looking for alternative sources of energy? There's wind technology, there's solar technology now coming online. Are we going to see more of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what we're really trying to focus on here now. It's not about increasing production, it's about increasing efficiency. And with that, that's where we're seeing a lot of the newer technology focused on, trying to find ways to bring out barrels smarter rather than more barrels as a number.
Keyur, when do you think oil prices will recover? When will there be this turnaround? When will prices start going up?
No, I think that the more compelling views I've gotten is, they'll start to climb up, by 2020 to $60 a barrel.
So we're going to see these kind of prices for what, another 5 years, 4 years?
Potentially.
What do you think, Carl?
I think we'll probably see them start to rise Q2 this year, into Q3. I think that probably around the end of the year, we'll probably average about a $45, $50 barrel of oil. we'll probably see higher sometime during the year. I think there's a lot of still at risk out there in the world that keep prices higher, and then probably $60 by next year.
What do you think, Abdul Latif?
I think the price will go up a little bit faster. I would say in this year it will increase very slowly, but price of oil is going to increase eventually because it's depleted energy. It's not renewable, and I hope it will go up sooner than later.
But should we be looking for some indicators of when it goes up? I mean, what are the benchmarks that we should be looking for?
Well, most of the oil price increase and decrease are technically psychological. But as I said, it's the first time that things are going against all logical analysts. For example, when the Iranian embargo was, the Western embargo was lifted by on Iran, Iran immediately declared that they would produce between 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day, which is yes, it's nice news, but in reality it's very hard to do it. To increase your capacity to half a million barrels per day, it needs years of preparations and billions of investments of infrastructures. This is why every single Western oil company is technically looking at Tehran for this.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there for this segment. Abdul Latif Al-Mulhim, Carl Larry, Ko Eugene, thanks to all of you for joining us. We are going to take a short break right now. More on the falling oil price and a view from Russia when we return. Please stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about falling oil prices and the impact on major producers and consumers worldwide. Russia is one of the countries most impacted, and now from Moscow joining us is Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst for Voice of Russia Radio. Dmitry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
Now, of course, this comes at a time, the falling oil prices, when the Russian economy is also contracting. What kind of effect is this having on Russia?
Well, certainly the effect is negative, primarily because no one could predict such a dramatic fall in the oil prices. But nevertheless, Russia can do something that the EU member countries can't do. It can devalue its currency. So what Russia did was just to devalue the ruble, and right now the payment balance is pretty good. And we're surviving. I mean, I go to the stores every day. I go to the metro every day. I see how people buy things. I see how people react to certain difficulties. And I would say that it is not dramatic. I would say that the crisis in 2008 and 2009 was more dramatic, not to speak about the crisis in the 90s, which was much deeper than the one we're having now.
Are there any plans for Russia to cut production in an effort to push the price up, or perhaps get into some kind of orchestrated effort with other major oil-producing countries, perhaps Saudi Arabia, to cut production?
The problem is that Russia has never been a member of the OPEC. We always had an independent policy on our oil production, and it is quite obvious that even among other major global oil producers, there is no agreement. There are clear differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between the OPEC and Venezuela, which also tries to pursue its own independent line. So it looks like everyone is trying to survive on their own. And Russia, despite gloomy predictions, managed to even increase its oil output last year, thus compensating a little bit, compensating the losses from the fall in the prices by the increase in the production.
Well, as you point out, Russia is not a member of OPEC, but what would Russia like to see OPEC do?
Of course, we would like to see more stability in the oil prices. These dramatic hikes in the oil prices and dramatic falls, none of them are good for the Russian economy. When the oil price goes dramatically high, then there is no incentive in Russia to do your own production. All the goods are imported from abroad, and in general, a lot of sectors in the economy slow down. When you have the dramatic fall in the oil prices like the one we are having now, then we have the problems with our state budget. Well, thanks to many fat years that we had, Russia has a huge so-called solidarity fund or hard currency fund. So there are hundreds of billions of dollars there, so we can compensate the losses for the time being. But in general, what Russia would like the OPEC to do is to make prices a little more stable. Don't allow the dramatic falls and the dramatic hikes in the oil prices.
You know, as one of our guests told us in an earlier part of the show, you get a country like Saudi Arabia, which has been over-reliant on its oil industry for income. It failed to diversify its economy. Is that a problem that Russia faces as well?
It is partially a problem. It is not as dramatic as in the countries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar, primarily because we have a different history. The Soviet Union was a self-reliant, self-sustained country. The Soviet Union produced just about everything it needed inside the country. So that legacy is still with us. We have a lot of industrial production despite all the problems that we faced in the 90s and in more recent past. So the effect is not as dramatic on the budget of, say, the countries like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, but it is painful. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it coincided with a deterioration in Russia's relations with the West. So when Russia stopped some of the Western food imports, and when Russia stopped the imports of some of their luxury goods from the West, it was not just in a bid to punish the West. The problem was that the fluctuations on the currency market made a lot of Western goods simply unattractive for a lot of Russians.
And if we look at this deterioration in the relationship between Russia and Western countries, I mean, Russia is already the target of Western sanctions right now. Do you see any political motivation behind the falling oil price?
That could be. There is a high probability that one of the factors that led to the slump in the oil prices was some kind of a secret deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia to beat down the prices. Also, part of the reason could be Saudi Arabia's willingness to basically to make some of the so-called fracking oil companies in the United States go bankrupt. So there are many factors, but none of them has been proven beyond any doubt. So I think that President Putin should be given credit for that. He doesn't get very enthusiastic about conspiracy theories. I'm pretty sure Mr. Yeltsin would have a conspiracy theory about the West being behind all of our problems. This is not Putin's rhetoric. He just says that we should view it as an opportunity. Okay, now that ruble is weak, and it makes sense to come to Russia because everything is very cheap here. Let's attract foreign tourists. Let's increase our own production. Let's become more self-reliant. This is the message coming from the government now, not the message like the West is against us, there is a conspiracy, everything is lost. That would be a defeatist message.
Okay, Dmitry, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us. That's Dmitry Babich joining us from Moscow there. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And of course, we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page @CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.